Welcome to another episode of Out of the Blank podcast. I'm here with Paul.
Good morning.
I love saying the word Paul. I don't know what it is. I think there was a cartoon show that came out like when I was a kid, and there was this monkey with three eyes, and he would just say, "Hi, my name's Paul." So I always have to give it with the emphasis. I don't think I could say it properly.
All right. Well, nice introduction.
Well, Paul, why don't you tell me a little bit about yourself, man?
Sure. My name is Paul Robichaud, and I teach English at Albertus Magnus College, which is a small college in New Haven, Connecticut. I'm from Toronto, Canada originally, and I've just published a book called Pan, The Great God's Modern Return, looking at the myth of Pan and the way he's been imagined through the centuries.
What is your idea or I guess description of Pan? Because I know pan probably for a lot of people that are thinking like, well, like a cooking pan when it's like a half man, half goat. It's a satyr basically.
Yeah, right. He's really close to those fauns and satyrs. He's a god who is half man and half goat. His lower part is usually depicted as a goat, so he's all shaggy, and his upper body is a man's, and then he's got typically two horns on top of his head, and he's known for playing the panpipes deep in the woods, and he's not one of the 12 Olympians. He never got included in that group. He's kind of an outsider. He's always out there in the wild, you know.
It's kind of like Hestia, for instance. She's the goddess of the harvest. And every depiction, especially if you read the Percy Jackson series, which I like a lot. I don't the movies are good, but man, if you want to talk about like a bad depiction of satyrs, that is definitely a bad depiction of satyrs. They kind of come off a little bit not how I would imagine them. I like horns that are obviously a little bit larger,
Yeah.
more majestic. These things are barely propping out of people's heads. But Hestia was always depicted in the stories as being a god who was always outside of Mount Olympus, that would kind of be by this dying fire and kind of look like a homeless person in a way, just because her skin was kind of because working out in the fields all day. I mean, farmers, the hardest working people in cases, they don't go around wearing suits all day. They wear things that they know that they're going to get dirty. That's kind of how she was depicted as. Now, with Pan, for instance, why specifically did you pick this one?
Well, I think I think because he's such an outsider and because he's so distinctive, so strange looking in his appearance, he just kind of he got my attention. And you know, I'd read I don't know if you or your readers know a children's book called Wind in the Willows by Kenneth Graham, or maybe seen the Disney film Toad of Toad's Hall.
Mhm.
But in the original book, there's a chapter called "The Piper at the Gates of Dawn," and he's really Pan, and he protects a baby otter who's gone missing, and the two characters, Mole and Rat, have to go find him, and they have this really kind of intense mystical vision experience with him. And that was one of my favorite books growing up, and that chapter always I found it really kind of haunting. And so I was just kind of uh, thinking about Pan, and as I started to look up kind of images of him, and so I realized there's this whole story really about him, and the way that he kind of bridges the world of nature and the world of the gods for the ancient Greeks. And as we get closer to the present, he as he is in Wind in the Willows, he starts to become more of a protector of the natural world, you know. And so he kind of speaks to us in our current moment with our concerns about the environment and climate change and all of those kinds of issues.
If I was going to take an example that would probably fit into the way the modern world or modern trends are starting to think of is kind of like Bigfoot. Like my description of Bigfoot is like a protector of the forest, if there is one out there. And that's kind of what Pan is. Pan's a protector. Pan's more of a, I mean, I guess you could say technical God, not like how the 12 are, but just one that is more in touch with the kind of the surrounding area, which would be nature in a way. And I think it gives a little bit more
Yeah.
mystery, but also a more modernization. Because if you look at the gods, for instance, every god has a certain niche or certain thing, Poseidon being water, Zeus being the god of all gods, but kind of the sky, Hades being death. But then when you look at like the forest, for instance, there's a lot of minor gods that kind of fill in as well too. And then if you want to talk a bigger globe scale of, literally the globe of Gaia, being the earth, but it's I feel like that's more of a connection basis that we really don't get to see. It doesn't really get popularized, only because I think what really gets the trending charts going is power. When you can see someone like destroy a whole planet or destroy or get into these giant
Right.
fighting scenes, and Pan's not really about that. Pan's more like you're lost on a journey, and this random person comes out, this guy, this stranger that helps you find the way and kind of brings the sense of like an outcast, but one of those outcasts where you start to question me like you're actually more helpful than anything. Like I understand that you don't like Hades, for instance. He's an outcast, but he's probably one of my favorites because if you hear the whole story, the true legend, he was kind of like, I guess, screwed over a little bit and then kind of
Yeah.
cast down with the final decision to kind of rule hell. He's just misunderstood. And that's kind of like if you're not in the clitch, then you're out of the group, I guess. So that's kind of what
Right.
Pan is.
Yeah, no, I think those are good points, and we do have all these gods and kind of mysterious supernatural figures who are sort of outside, kind of outside the mainstream, and Hades is a good example. I mean, he rules the underworld, but the underworld, especially for the ancient Greeks, that's an integral part of the universe, right? And he's not evil, really.
Yeah.
He's just he's consigned to the underworld, and he rules the kingdom of the dead. But he tends to get portrayed as an evil kind of figure, like in the Disney movie Hercules, for instance. I mean, he's funny, but he's really not he's really not an evil god. He just has he's kind of responsible for an area that makes a lot of people uncomfortable. We don't really like to think about death um, or that kind of thing. But these outsider gods, they oversee parts of the world, parts of the universe that we're uncomfortable with. So, you mentioned Bigfoot, and thinking about uh, other figures kind of connected with nature, like the Green Man in English folklore, or the Green Knight, the recent film. The Green Knight's portrayed a bit like Groot in the Avengers
Yeah.
movies. He's got bark on his skin, and he's really part of nature. And towards the end of the film, I don't want to give anything away, but he's actually hard to see. He's kind of part of the forest. And I think I think we're fascinated by these figures who are both partly in our world and partly completely other, completely alien. Like Bigfoot, Sasquatch. He's kind of a human being. I mean, he's got feet, right? He's got arms. He's sort of humanoid, but if he's glimpsed, he's only seen in fleeting glances, or he's heard, and he's always disappearing into the woods. And whether or not there's a real creature behind that, really, it says something about our sense of our relationship to the wild, that the wild is always just beyond us, beyond our sense of who we are.
I know I've seen many photos of statues of like people be like, well, that's a statue of a satyr, or that's a statue of a centaur, and I'm like, well, the statue of a satyr that you're pointing at, he's always depicted holding one object, and that one object is the
Mm.
pan flute, and you start to realize, like, especially if you actually dive into the mythos, I guess, and I think society got a good glimpse of it with like the Hercules movie, which if you're an actual Greek mythology, you know the history behind it. You're like, this is like, ah, come on, you're walking some
Yeah,
Disney territory for sure. But you start to look at how there's a big chunk missing out of just like the basics. And I think it's because the school systems really don't dive into it unless you take a specific class for Greek mythology. And I think if anything, I mean, I think there was a Pan movie, and then there was like another movie that came out with the guy who plays Harry Potter, Daniel Radcliffe, which was
hmm
like not really Pan, but gave the depictions of Pan. The dude started growing horns, and then in this weird way ended up turning into the devil, which was like you have a guy with horns on the front cover, then you have ivy growing around him, so people are thinking it's going to be some type of like satyr movie or something. Like at least that's what I
right.
thought. But
Yeah,
you would think this would be a type of topic to go for in a new movie now, because how many people right now feel like an outcast? How many people are getting into forms of meditation to be able to connect with their roots or connect with the
yeah,
earth around them? Well, a nature spirit, I mean, that's a big one right there. I'm more belief that like I like the Greek mythology angle. I like giving perspectives on, or personification to these things that we really can't explain, even though there's science, sure, but it's much fun are much more fun to entertain the idea that the ocean is being moved by a god in a way, or there's not just one, but there's multiple. That means we have multiple things that we can believe in, not just one specific thing or one person that commands all.
Yeah, and I think the ancient Greeks, like a lot of peoples, a lot of cultures around the world, had a sense of nature as really being alive, as being um, alive and kind of conscious, embodied in figures like Pan or the satyrs or the nymphs, these spirits, who inhabit trees or streams or rivers, or oceans. And because nature is alive, nature can be, related to and connected with in some way. It can speak to us, just like we can speak back to it. So it's not it's not something that's just out there and unconscious and something we can, inhabit or exploit or whatever, but it's a living presence, and I think that's what we encounter in a figure like Pan, who, in his earliest form was mainly a protector of flocks and, sheep and goats, but also a god of the hunt, and associated with the feeling that we call panic. So in fact, the word panic comes from Pan's name, and it's the sense of sudden terror that his presence was believed to inspire. And it's that sense of sudden terror we might have when we're, in an unfamiliar wilderness, feel the forest closing in on us, or, deep in a cave where it's too dark to see. It's that sudden terror, that kind of animal terror that overcomes us, where we're not even able to kind of control it, and you mentioned we kind of live in a moment where outsiders are really interesting to us, because so many of us, feel kind of alienated a little on the outside. We don't feel included in, I don't know, the politics, the society, the culture in some way or another, or it doesn't kind of meet our needs or our sense of who we are. And I think that, Pan is a figure like that. And that sense of panic that he inspires is very much, the the moment, very much part of the moment we're living in, right? I mean, you think of the widespread diagnosis of anxiety people have, and people experience panic attacks all the time. Um, and so I think that he connects with our moment in some interesting ways, not just in terms of the environment, but also in terms of our kind of emotional life, our sense of the world being threatening and unknowable, and really alienating for us in a
I
lot of
think
ways.
the gods to me, and I want to get your perspective on what
Yeah.
these kind of mean to you, for instance. But for me, the gods, the major ones, seem like major working cogs to, if you're looking at the sky, for instance, I think Zeus was created. You see thunder happening. He's like, a god must be doing that. The amount of anger or rage you see in the sky lighting up with this ferocious bolt of electricity. And then the ocean, it's just somehow just goes chaotic and so uncontrollable and unpredictable. That God has to be doing that as well too. The earth is just ever so changing. There has to be more than just one that's commanding this kind of ship in a way. And I think they're the major cogs, the major ones, like the main group of gods, the Olympians are this thing that, yeah, this is the system. This is how the system runs. They keep the system running. But I think it's all the little minor ones that don't really get talked about, because I always questioned, like, if they're spending so much time in Olympus, then how is everything just running so properly? There's got to be somebody maintaining those things. And those are the side characters. I mean, Pan, I don't know the whole legend behind how Pan began or how, it's kind of, I guess, changed over the years. I just know a basic description of this character. But to me, it's a sense of like that, something that people can connect to on a form of just bringing it back to bare bones, bringing
Hmm.
it back to before technology was invited into your headspace, and really just kind of enjoying nature. I mean, I've been spending way less time on social media and just sitting outside and really enjoying the wind, smelling that. I mean, just finding basic things that reset me in a way to where I'm not feeling like the world's going to end tomorrow. You know what I mean? And I think that's
Yeah.
the importance of his character.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think when we're thinking about those Greek gods, the Poseidon and Zeus and Hera and so on, they're kind of like they're gods of the big picture, right? They're like you say, they're like the big gears that are keeping everything going. But there's also something uh, kind of too big about them. Like they're so far from ordinary life. They're controlling forces that are so massive and so beyond human control. Imagine being an ancient Greek sailor going out onto the ocean. Is Poseidon in a good mood today? Did he accept the sacrifice we
Am I
made?
going to
Or
see my dad on his long trip home?
right? Yeah, exactly. And so there's something kind of intimidating and really just beyond our comprehension about them. And these gods like Pan or like Hestia, you mentioned, the goddess of the hearth, they're or sorry, goddess of the hearth and harvest, I guess. The There's something human about them because they're connected with human activities. They're connected with the human world, right? So again, Pan as god of the shepherds, and the earliest kind of engravings to him are these little bronze figures of shepherds that are, they'll just be marked dedicated to Pan or something like that, or thanking him for something or other. But it seems like for the ancient Greeks, you sort of had the official Olympians, and they were part of the big, public festivals and so on. And then you had these sort of lesser deities like Pan, or figures like the nymphs, who would have little temples, little altars dedicated to them, and who connected to ordinary people in a way that brought them closer to nature, brought them closer to their work, to the harvests, to those kinds of day-to-day activities. And they seem to have inspired a kind of personal devotion that maybe these big gods with their intimidating threats and dangers never really did.
Do you think it's the perceptual change that society has kind of invoked to where we are today? And please forgive me, any anthropologists listening out there. I know I'm not trying to conflate positive now to the thinking of back then, but imagine the way we think today and now replace that, switch them from back in the past to how we think today and just switch those. Pan would be the elite. Pan is what people can connect to now. Like, for instance, back in the day, statues, and there might have been altars to Pan and minor deities or minor gods in a way, but it was power was the thing. It was like, we got to make a giant statue of Zeus or he's going to throw a thunderbolt and kill us all. That
Right.
was the whole thing of like, make them big, make them tough. And there's small statues where I start to look at like, there had to be worshipers for Pan. There had to be basic people that just really was trying to find the deeper connection, the easiest one, the one that was like right in front of your face, which for all of us, right in front of our face, the easiest cool down method is just wind or just something that happens to do with water or sunlight or something that can recharge. I mean, if you're in a town that, experiences like in the UK, they experience rain like 40% of their week or 60% of their week. They're miserable a lot of the time. And talk about, well, today's a sunny day. I'm not doing any recording. It's like, what do you mean? It's sunny every day. It's like, never here. This is a rare occasion. And it's like those small things that can kind of reset us in a way. Those gods that we can look at now, like Pan, would be an ultimate today over Zeus or the powerful thing because it's about a deeper connection with oneself. And I feel like if we switched the thinking we have now with the thinking that we had back then and just switch those, so back then we'd be thinking how we do now, we would have this kind of, I guess, over encompassing type feel of like, okay, Pan is the one we should be building giant statues for because he doesn't want the power. I think that's why I like Hestia so much too, is like she didn't want to be included in Olympus. Everyone's like, well, she always sits outside. It's like, yeah, because she doesn't like the BS. The gods, in a way, are a lot of BS. And we talk about, like, for politics, for instance, today, my theory is that people, like, when football was gone, you just hopped onto a new trend. And sadly,
Mhm.
this one is like the best reality show you've ever seen because you see a guy with an eye patch pop up on screen, you're like, Jesus, where are we at? But it's the BS, and that's the Olympians is kind of a BS in a way. It's more of like this. They have a lot of power, but if you saw Wrath of the Titans or any other movie when Hades had to like save everybody's ass, was you start to realize they're powerful because you give them the power. Then when they don't have the power, they're as big as the next guy. They're not really this thing that you think so high in their head. But the ones that, were neglected or were outside and didn't want to be a part of that, They didn't need people to worship them. They didn't want all that type of stuff. It's nice to have it, sure, but they noticed that it's more about just trying to do good in a way that you wouldn't notice anything really change. That's how you know good is happening, because we can easily do one thing and it can destroy a whole bunch of stuff. But if you're able to just like, well, the world's running today, I don't see Pan doing anything. Are you just noticing like that a giant plate of food didn't get dropped in front of your face, or are you noticing that it's actually all around you? It's these small things that are happening that you're not really taking into account because you look for the big present sitting on your lap that a god could toss down a sword and be like, thank you. Well, what about the all the stuff that's building up around in the background that you're not noticing is running? And imagine if he was just gone and stopped doing that. Imagine if bees just stopped, flowers wouldn't be happening. There'd be no pollination or anything like that. There might be some from certain seeds or whatever coming off of trees and dropping and spreading that way. But pollen is a major factor because of bees. Bees help spread it and keep these flowers growing. Imagine if all bees just died. You wouldn't see that. That's kind of what Pan is. You're doing a lot of stuff in the background that you're not noticing because it's not all one giant thing right in front of your face.
Yeah, that it's interesting because one of the early things that happens with Pan is the Greeks. So his name is connected to the root of the word is connected to pastures, right? Like where goats and sheep might be. But early on, the Greeks confuse his name with their other word Pan, which means everything. And uh, in a poem called the Orphic Hymn to Pan, he's imagined as being the force that almost like the force actually in Star Wars. He's like this force that connects and binds everything together. So that sense of like Pan happening in the background, kind of keeping it all together, is pretty close to how one of the ways that the ancient Greeks kind of imagined him. So he's kind of keeping everything together, keeping things running, binding the different elements of the universe together. At the same time, he's this kind of helpful god of shepherds and sheep, and he is a helper. The early statues suggest that he helped shepherds with maybe protecting their sheep or recovering lost sheep and things like that. But even the ancient Athenians, they believed that Pan helped them win the Battle of Marathon during their wars with the Persians. And the story Herodotus tells us that their runner named Philippides was running along, and Pan suddenly appeared to him and said, "Hey, how come the Athenians don't acknowledge me? Because I actually really like them, and I'd be happy to help you if you just ask me." And so he delivered this message to the Athenians, and they agreed, and they instituted a race in Pan's honor and set aside a little temple in a cave for him. And sure enough, the Persians panicked at the Battle of Marathon, and the Athenians were very grateful. So he was really thought of it as a helper, and I think it is connected to this idea of Pan as well as kind of holding everything together, kind of keeping things going in the background. He's benevolent.
Do you think that maybe there wasn't a lot of giant noticeable temples because people didn't have the care for building up to something that was just a helper? Something that seemed more passive than aggressive. I think a lot of people built statues of the Greek gods, or, if you would talk about Ares, god of war, not only because it was a big part of war, was a lot that was going on and kind of capturing places, but it's a power thing. If you have a giant statue and you like me and you create a village, we have a giant statue of Zeus in the background that we built out of like a pyramid high or so.
Yeah.
People be like, I'm not messing with them, man, because they're worshiping that guy and they like power. Obviously, they must be war people. But if we had a giant statue of Pan, people would look at us different. It'd be more like those are those friendly guys. It's like, oh, well, then they would just come over and raid us.
Yeah. Yeah. Pan's temples are kind of interesting because I'm not a classicist, so I don't know all the details of this, but uh, from what I looked at writing the Pan book, I guess in Arcadia, the part of Greece where Pan starts out, there is some evidence there's some archaeological evidence of small temples to Pan. But as soon as Pan starts getting worshipped outside there, he never has his own temples. They'll build altars to him in in a cave, a little shrine to him in the side of a mountain, or out in the out in the woods or something like that. And there seems to be a sense that he didn't want to be worshipped in that sort of big, public, powerful way. And I think your sense as well that he just wasn't on the same level as these big, powerful gods. We're not gonna have this massive statue to Pan in this huge public festival. He's kind of off to the side. He's sort of worshipped. He's given his foot race in Athens, but his worship is often more concealed, more kind of hidden from public view. There's a few exceptions. There's the remains of a temple in modern Israel, up in Banias, and that's in the side of a mountain. And they apparently built a kind of temple facade to this, but he shared this temple with other gods. So he's, as he is generally, Pan is always a little on the outside. He's not at the center of Greek religion the way these big, powerful gods like Zeus and Poseidon and others are. Yeah.
Does he have any giant main kind of accomplishments or myths that ever get talked about him, or is it just kind of like the basic tale?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, because the ancient Arcadian shepherds didn't generally write anything down, and we don't really know what stories they told about Pan. And so the mythology we have about Pan is really late, and they're kind of silly stories. They're Pan chasing nymphs for the most part. So the most famous myth of Pan is Pan sees the nymph Syrinx and is completely taken by her beauty, and he pursues her, and she's completely terrified. Pan's pursuing her, and so she runs down to the river, and the other nymphs who are there see Pan approaching, and so they change her into a reed. And Pan is very disappointed as he reaches out to her, and she turns into a reed. But he then takes the reed and sort of chops it up and makes his panpipes, and he plays a kind of sad tune to express his feelings about not being able to capture the nymph Syrinx. And so that's the origin of Pan's pipes.
Oh my God. I just was like, I had two major thoughts. One, I did not know that's where it came from. Two, is that not slaughter? He just mutilated somebody. And I knew that was like the thing with nymphs, was that if you caught them and if you were able to catch them as the person that they were, you could marry them, or they would be connected to you forever. So it's kind of being like locked down. So that's why everyone always runs. When you hear stories about nymphs, everybody's always running or turning into something. And
yeah,
that's nuts. That's slaughter.
It is. And the other thing I think a lot of readers are kind of uncomfortable with the pursuit of nymph stories, whether it's Pan or Apollo, is their goal is to rape the nymph. I mean, they want to take them, and so the transformation, whether it's into ivy or reeds or whatever, is a way for the nymph to escape that fate. The Greek gods are often dangerous, and they're predatory. There are other stories where Pan is pursuing the nymph Echo, or another nymph named Pitys, and by and large he never succeeds. He never captures any of these nymphs. But what's missing in the stories of Pan are the kinds of great deeds that a lot of the other gods are associated with. There's a very late myth where Pan helps Zeus in his battle with the Titans by tricking a Titan named Typhoeus into giving back Zeus's sinews after he's kind of dismembered Zeus. And so Zeus is able to kind of reassemble himself and win the battle. But for the most part, he's not doing these great deeds like Poseidon or Zeus or these others. Yeah.
Well, none of these great deeds that are written down, never talk about any of these little side characters that help out. That it's always the main focus is like, well, the three gods, accomplished their goal and took out their father Kronos, and then were able to, take claim of the throne or whatever. But you start to realize that there's minor little details that get left out. Like, they had help along the way. It wasn't just three people, it was multiple other little minor ones that don't get included because their tale or their legend just wasn't big enough in the eyes of people back then. We only care about, like, let's take the main cliff notes of it and then put it into a story. We do that now today too. There's a lot of minor details that get left out that actually expand the story out even more and actually make it more interesting too.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the appeals of these kind of lesser gods too, is there's, we've got the stories about Zeus. We know about his quarrels with Hera over, the nymphs and goddesses he's chasing, and so on. We know about Mars and his rivalry with Hephaestus for Venus and all of that. But these minor gods like Pan and so on, there's a lot more imaginative room with them. We can imagine stories about them. We can kind of reinvent them and sort of fill in those blanks, as you're saying. And I think that makes them in some ways a little more compelling. There's more to imagine, there's more to say about them. So I think that's one of the appeals.
Is
Definitely.
your favorite tale of Pan the same one as the one that's kind of always known about him, or do you have one that a lot of people don't know about?
Oh yeah, that's a great question. One of the myths that I discovered writing the book was one I'd never heard of, and it again shows Pan in a kind of helpful role, and it's connected to a myth that if you've read Greek mythology, you might know. It's the story where Persephone goes into the underworld and marries Hades, right? Or Hades seizes her
I'll say against her will.
against her will once again, right? These gods chasing goddesses and so on, and he seizes her and brings her to the underworld. And Demeter, her mother, eventually works out a deal, right, where Persephone can come back to Earth for half the year, and that's why we have spring and summer
Yeah.
instead of endless winter or something like that. Well, there's a story related to that myth where Demeter is so overcome with grief that nothing will grow, and I think this is taking place between the kidnapping of Persephone and Demeter kind of negotiating this sort of deal with Hades. But the gods look for her everywhere. Zeus can't find her. Nobody can find her, and she's hidden herself. She's hiding sort of deep in the forests where no one can find her. But because Pan lives in the wilderness, he's able to find her. In fact, he finds her accidentally, and he tells the other gods, and he's able to persuade her to come back and make the plants grow and the land be fertile again. And so once again, he's kind of in that role of being kind of a minor character, kind of a helper character, but in that version of the story, a really essential one, right? We need those minor characters who do things like find the missing goddess for the bigger stars of the myth. So that I thought was an interesting story, because it's one of the few myths of Pan that really connects him with the rest of Greek mythology. His pursuit of Syrinx is just kind of a story out there on its own. It's not really linked with these other stories.
Well, I'll say it's not really a good look of him either by chasing. I mean, if you look at like how Medusa, for instance, everyone was trying to cancel her. Like I think almost like half a year ago, everyone was talking about like, can you believe that this is what men do? They do this, and it's like, well, hang on a second. That's not really this. It's a story too, but with chasing nymphs, for instance, I mean, it's a bad kind of look, not really, and you can't really base it off like how we think now. Like I said before, with anthropology, it's a little bit, you have to think in the time set back then, and back then was all about conquering and taking whatever you wanted, and if you could, you were an accomplished person for doing so. But this role kind of explains what his value is and kind of his power is in a way, which is the fact that he's this keeper of the forest, his this natural force or this type of thing that can come out of the woods and literally help plants be able to grow again by finding someone that they really needed in a crucial time where what happens if he didn't help, if he didn't accidentally come across her, then everything would have into chaos. You know what I mean?
Yeah, right. And it's a little bit it's not that different in some ways from his role there at the Battle of Marathon, right? He's also kind of entering showing up in a desperate moment, a desperate situation, and just doing enough to ensure that things work out for everyone, you know. And that role of helper is one that Pan kind of keeps throughout the centuries in a lot of ways. You know, kind of getting back to Kenneth Grahame and The Wind in the Willows, where, you know, his little baby otter has gone missing, and the piper at the gates of dawn, as he's called there, protects him and kind of guards him on this little island in the river until the other animals can find him. And that's really consistent with, you know, his earliest origins as a protector of sheep and goats. And I think, you know, this idea of him being the sort of God that people can connect with, that people need, I think is really closely related to his role as helper. And this kind of this God chasing the nymphs, you know, it's hard to know where those stories about Pan originate. They are recorded very late. Goats have always been associated with lust, and a lot of the later statues depicting Pan show him, you know, trying to seduce, you know, seducing Aphrodite or seducing a shepherd, or in one case, and I hesitate to say this, but copulating with a goat. And the Romans seem to have thought Pan was, in some ways, kind of funny, you know, because he's in their minds, he's really closely connected with lust, and so they're always imagining him getting up to, you know, getting up to no good, trying to seduce everyone and everything in sight. But how closely that is connected with how Pan was imagined by the early Arcadians, you know, that's really hard to say.
I look at like Pan's appearance and I'm like, there's only really two ways you can kind of consume his character, and that's either by making him evil, by giving him the long horns like I like, or you make him goofy because he is half man, half goat. You can make fun of him,
Yeah,
so you have to create some type of myth or legend that makes him seen as a goofy character, a clown in a way. But there's a way to make him look peaceful. And I feel like that's kind of what a lot of people can kind of soak up out of a lot of these myths too, is that he kind of comes in, he's an essential. I think including him in a lot of these major stories, even if he had a minor part to play that kind of leads up to the bigger kind of end all fight or the climax of the story, it shows a character that is not necessarily caring so much about people, but more caring about the things that we don't really focus on, which is the balance of life, you know, the harmony
yeah,
that kind of goes in within it. By making him peaceful is by giving sometimes the smallest horns as possible, but giving him an approachable type attitude, something that he might be scary if you catch him late at night at 2 o'clock in the morning walking through the woods, but someone that can come out when you really need it. Like if your crops are not really crops not growing, but your livestock is lost, and then some goat comes out of the forest with a flute, plays it. Next thing you know, all these sheep start approaching out of the wilderness, and then you have this sense of like, oh my God, I'm not going to starve. My family's going to be able to eat, and it's this kind of like balance where you notice that even though it might not be affecting you immediately, it affects you in the long chain of events, which is where we see with the balance of nature.
yeah, right. And you mentioned Percy Jackson earlier, and you know, the I think that's kind of the role we see Pan in the Percy Jackson series, you know, where he's discovered kind of fading away uh, one last time, and he has this positive message about, you know, it's up to us to protect nature, it's up to us to protect the natural world, because his, you know, in that series he's imagined as kind of fading away. He's just kind of kept around because the satyrs are still looking for him, right? I mean, they still believe in him, but you know, he's been keeping the nature in the balance. But now it's up to us to kind of take that on and take that responsibility for the natural world, the wilderness, the parts of the earth that are kind of, kind of off our radar, that we don't think about all the time because they're separate from our human world, but are absolutely critical for the health of the planet.
Besides finding like temples and caves or shrines, like small little shrines to him, have you ever tried to find out who or what civilization or what group of people built these things and were like, because every kind of like, there was God, I'm gonna blank on the name, but I think it was Argus that was specifically towards like a certain god, and then there's different Greek civilizations at this time that were based on like this is the one god. We have a temple to Athena, we have a temple to Zeus, we have it's just one temple and for that god. It's kind of like in the Percy Jackson series. There's 12 cabins, but there's 13 but one is like all beaten and broken down and crappy, and everyone can guess that that's Hades' cabin because Hades doesn't have any kids,
Right.
and so there's nobody to ever maintenance or take care of the cabin. All the other gods, like Zeus's, is this giant one that's like looks exactly like how Zeus would. He's the most powerful. Then there's Poseidon right on the lake, but what about like the civilizations, for instance, that built to these gods and made temples? Have you ever looked to see if there was a specific niche group for Pan and that what would their lifestyle be like?
Yeah, well, I guess the niche group for Pan was, the ancient Arcadians, and so Arcadia is a part of Greece that's in the kind of the southern part, the southern Peloponnese, and um, they in classical times, the other Greeks, the ones we know best, like the Spartans and the Athenians, they really regarded the Arcadians as kind of primitive, and their form of the Greek language was closer to um, the older Mycenaean form of Greek, and they were believed to be the original inhabitants there, and they were sometimes described as being older than the moon. They just were like these primordial people who lived there, and um, the reason for this seems to have been that the Arcadians were uh, pastoral people. Like they herded sheep and goats, and that was a big part of their economy and a big part of their life. Whereas the other Greek states were they had cities and relied on agriculture, and the Arcadians had some agriculture, but I guess in Arcadia the soil is really not very fertile, so you can't really grow anything.
Yeah.
So the people there continued to rely on animals for their sustenance, and they uh, they lived in kind of smaller settlements and towns rather than building big cities. They didn't write things down,
Yeah.
as far as we know. So Pan kind of comes out of this world, and again, we don't really know what stories they told about Pan, or really how old Pan is. Uh, in the past, people speculated that Pan might go back even further, thousands of years, to the Indo-Europeans, who were, pastoral nomads who traveled around the steppes of Asia and then sort of spread out to Europe and to India. And I guess we're more skeptical of that possibility now, but he's clearly a very ancient god, and it's really not till he spreads outside of Arcadia that we start to get stories about him, and we get these little cave temples that are built to him, and there's a few remains of some kind of more proper temples to him in Arcadia, but I don't think they were very big from what I've read about them. Yeah.
I always thought it seemed like a lot of the ones that were there before the gods were, if you want to say Titans in a way. I know we consider Pan as a minor god, but Pan seems older than Zeus. And I think it's on the basis of these similar traits with like these Titans that don't really have statues or don't have these coliseums or meeting temples. They're kind of all on their own thing, just kind of they're a force for sure, but they're not building giant monoliths. Or if you see, it's the newer ones that we start to see that claim the power. Artemis eventually became god of the hunt and was kind of this thing where she had her own I guess, group of huntresses that would, go and fight and, go hunt every single night or whatever. She's supposed to be Apollo's sister. And you start to realize like these ones that really are these bombastic characters, these giant, like kick through the door with guns blazing, are the newer versions. Aphrodite gets talked about a lot. She's kind of like this, lover that goes all around and everything like that everyone kind of sees as this beautiful goddess. She's literally the goddess of beauty. And it's these ones that we hear about. Athena, for instance, the goddess of wisdom, was always prayed in battle. Ares, a son of one of the major gods, you start to realize are these newer age that get talked about in such glamorous ways that seem to have the most appearances and most stories to them, because they're always trying to. I mean, it's like if you're in your 20s or if you're a teenager, you want to go out and explore the world. You want to show everyone who you are. The ones that have been here longer are the ones that get less talked about or less seen because they don't really care. It's kind of like being in your 60s and like, what the hell's the point of going out? I could just watch TV all day.
Yeah, the Olympians, I think most of the Olympians, they are ancient gods, but by the time we get them in kind of the form we recognize them, they've gone through a lot of transformations, and they've become, the gods we recognize, these kind of shiny new celebrity gods, and the kind of local people out there in the countryside, they're still kind of they're still worshiping their local gods, the gods of the streams and the rivers and the forests, and we hear a lot less about them because they're outside this main pantheon. And like Pan, for instance, he's not one of the 12 Olympians, and they seem to have had a lot of trouble incorporating him into the larger stories of the other gods. So there's a lot of disagreement about who Pan's parents were, for example. There's depending on what source you look at, there's all these different nymphs. Sometimes his father is imagined as Zeus, other times he's imagined as Zeus's half-brother. The consensus seemed to be his father was probably Hermes,
Really?
but Pan doesn't sync with mythological time in Greek myths, because if he's the son of Hermes, he's too young to have helped Zeus in his battle with the Titans. So if he was there, then he must have been,
he would have some speed
kind of
to
contemporary.
him too.
Yeah, right. Some speed to him. I don't know how fast you can run on those little goat legs, but
Well, every depiction of him is like slowly walking out of a forest or some type of
right.
slow pace to him.
Yeah. And I think that's that's another reason for the kind of the shortage of real myths about many of these gods and goddesses on the outside, is they're not always well integrated into the kind of the overall mythology of Olympus, which is the official Greek religion, right? It's the public religion, it's the religion of all the Greek city states. And so it's not like the Bible or something like that. There's no official version of the Greek myths. I mean, that's one of the things that is kind of appealing about them. There's often different versions of the stories, but there's often a sort of general consensus about what happened and in what order and who was whose parents and things like that. And that all starts to fall apart when you look at these less central gods. Yeah.
I'm a fan of Poseidon just because I like the water, but Hephaestus is probably up there on one of my top favorites, only on a factor of there's so many depictions of him. One is like he's super jacked from working in the irons all day in the fires,
Right.
but he's always ugly. It's it. Like his own mother Hera just goes, "You're ugly." Like it just calls him out blatantly. Like, and I like that because he's not one you see. Like Ares is like the one that wants to go out and destroy and wants to, he's like the young like jock son, and then Hephaestus is kind of like the cast out in a way where there's like similarities with Pan. I wouldn't be surprised if him and Pan were brothers. I mean, that's the whole factor, is there's that kind of connection of being like, yeah, I'm here only because you need weapons all the time, but you guys don't need or care about me for anything else. And it's like you start to realize there's this outcast type of personality. Even though he's involved in the group, you can sense an extrovert.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting with Hephaestus because he does right, like Pan has this kind of goatish appearance, and Hephaestus is ugly. He's lame, right? He's lame in one leg. He walks around with a limp. the other gods all make fun of him. And yet he's another one of these gods who's actually really helpful to human beings, right? He's the blacksmith god. He taught, he kind of, he presides over human beings when they're working in at the blacksmith's forge, making their weapons or horseshoes or whatever other useful things you can make out of iron. And so we again have a god who's really helpful, beneficial to human beings, that is connected with something that human beings do and things that human beings need. But in the world of the gods, those big Olympians, he's really treated with a lack of respect, right?
I think it's the Icarus story, the one who's like the son of Icarus's dad was the son of Hephaestus, right? Because it's Daedalus, right? Or who's Daedalus?
Yeah, I think Daedalus is son of Hephaestus. I think that sounds right.
Because I think the Percy Jackson movie probably did like a good example of what that was when they're trying to go through the labyrinth. And you get to see the inner workshop, and it reminds me of Leonardo da Vinci. Of like, just I would love if there's one place I could go, would be able to discover Leonardo's workshop in the midst of the creating, with all the scraps of paper being littered
Yeah.
across the ground and little contraptions hanging everywhere that aren't completely finished. And it's kind of like this big example when someone told me, why would you care about an artist, even though Da Vinci is famous, but he was a completely unfinished, he would never finished anything. And I was like, well, his biggest thing was that you could always add something to it. You can never stop creating. And I'm like, that's why he's the most renowned unfinished artist, is because he always believed that there was one thing you could possibly add, or there's something else there. And I'm like, that's just a sign of always wanting to do better and always wanting to create better. It seems like in the world that we live in today, people are happy with the product that they get and they throw it out there real fast. And it's like, well, next thing you know, there's bugs and there's updates and there's all these things to it. It's like you weren't ready to have it there, but you just wanted to get your foot out the door, which I'm not against. But it's also like appreciating the craft, because if you do sit on something and wait till it's perfected, and then you're the guy that's like, it's never perfected, you're never going to release that to the public. But I don't know. It has me thinking deeper on a lot of things. I always get fascinated when you look down Greek mythology, or you look down anything, the Renaissance, the Victorian era, and you start to realize like the basics that we still think the same. We still
Mhm.
have like some major, like, and I think this is important stuff to highlight, especially about Pan, for instance, because how many people are walking around with an identity crisis going on in their life? I mean, that's most of the population now. I consider mental health, for instance, as an identity crisis. A lot of people are upset just because they don't really know where they fit or who they are, or what do I do? And I'm like, I feel like Pan's the type of character, or any outcast character that has never really been highlighted majorly, should be start showing more, because I think it gives a bigger aspect to, hey, just because you're in this position doesn't mean anybody in the world has not experienced the same thing. You're gonna get through it. You're gonna find something. So don't worry so much. And then that's kind of what these characters show in a way, is like, hey, maybe you don't fit in this group. I mean, the Olympians, to me, that seems like a frat, that like a frat club in a way. So
They're a bit toxic, right?
yeah, they're always making fun of each other, and just maybe it's a fun like joke with friends, but at the same time, they're either fighting each other, there's wars going on. And this is the weirdest part, is when there's wars going on between different gods and goddesses, they're still in the same room, not even mentioning it. It's like, well, I hear you've been fighting with him. We're not talking about that. It's like, well, you're blowing up everything that he's ever created. So we kind of have to address this, but you just sit there and mind your P's and Q's. It just shows you how, you know, people have two different sides or two different
Mhm.
things.
Yeah. Well, I think these kind of outsider gods, we're talking about Hephaestus, but Pan as well. I think they're really appealing today because if you think about, a god like Pan, who's part animal, looks human, but is also, a powerful god in his own way, but also a helper. And a god that's part goat and part man, you could say, kind of has a built-in identity crisis.
Yeah.
Who is he, right? But the way he's been imagined, the way that even in terms of his sort of connection to sexuality, he pursues nymphs. He also pursues young men herding sheep. He's kind of he's inclusive of of us, of the natural world, different sexualities, our idea of the divine. I think he's kind of he's an appealing figure at a time when I think you're right. A lot of us aren't really sure who we are, aren't really sure where we fit in to the greater scheme of things. Maybe we don't like the labels that are available, that society might want to put on us. And I think in turn that can lead us to having a little more compassion, a little more understanding for people who are different from us, and also a greater appreciation of nature too, which is both different from us, but also part of us. We're not separate from it.
Playing the note or the tune of empathy.
Yeah, definitely.
That was a reference to his pan flute, but
Yeah, very good.
it was better in my head, I guess.
No.
But Paul, I appreciate you for giving me your time to do the show. Is there a place where people can find you and also find links to your books as well too? I'll make sure to include them in the description.
Sure. Yeah. My book is published by Reaktion Books. It's out in the UK right now and in Europe. It'll be released in North America on November 19th. You can pre-order it at your favorite online bookseller or your independent bookshop. Yeah, and I'm on there on Twitter as well at Paul J. Robichaud.
Is there anything you want to say to anybody before we wrap up the show?
No, just it's been great talking to you and talking about all these different myths and what they can mean for us today.
We'll make sure to get you on again. And I appreciate you for doing the podcast. And thanks for listening to this episode of Out of the Blank Podcast.